Welcome to the Ready Podcast, where we explore issues shaping education today. I'm your host, Eades, and in today's episode, we delve into a topic close to our hearts, Indigenous education. The formation of education of elementary and high school students, and how they're not learning the historical injustices of Indigenous peoples. We will also discuss the transcendence and shift towards a neoliberal education which works to deregulate what's important within schools and Canadian education and a shift towards a wealth and economical driven society. We should really step it up as people on Indigenous lands to help prioritize Indigenous education and the covering of Indigenous topics within our schooling system. Now, we're on to the next segment. Now, to start off, we'll establish what Indigenous education truly entails and what actions we as people can take to actively make a difference. Indigenous education is rooted in the rich cultural traditions, languages, and histories of Indigenous peoples. It goes beyond this conventional teaching methods like the teacher and student that's popularized in the Western education. It encompasses this need to be true to oneself through one's emotions, spiritual, and physical aspects, with a deeper connection to land values for all living beings. Indigenous communities are very involved within the younger generations of Indigenous children and taught them sustainable methods such as cultural hunting techniques and how to live and respect the land that we're on. It's an embodiment of ourself, or for better wording, an extension of ourself as human beings. Indigenous children grew up with a great adoration for their lands and understanding of the complex interplays of the world. Now, although I'm not Indigenous, I was born in Ethiopia, a country within Africa, and I had similar norms and traditions. I wasn't really a city boy, and I'm from the suburbs of Ethiopia where formal education was not easily accessible for those, and only those who were wealthy were able to attain some semblance of westernized education. It was our parents' and community's role and responsibility to teach us the ways of life and how to proceed within our day-to-day life. Their teachings were influenced from the generations before them, and so on. This great adoration for the many wonders of Ethiopia, such as Lalibela, which is a big church known in Ethiopia, and the many other mountains, shaped how we respected and inhabited our land as people. Each region contributed to this cultural shaping of the way of life for its inhabitants, and the traditional practice which is very ingrained in my day-to-day life right now, such as the coffee ceremonies we have or the rhythmic dance forms, which reflect our deeper connection to the land and this common shared identity we have. I find myself sometimes contemplating how delicate the balance between our tradition and transformation to this westernized life affected me as a person. Life in Ethiopia, with its contrasts and complexities, invites introspection and this universal theme of identity, change, and enduring human spirit. It was a very profound journey that continues to unfold with each step I take within this westernized schooling system. It really opened my eyes to how differently everything was, and this more like neoliberalistic society which is more focused on producing these compliant workers and trying to teach students essentially that their job is as people is to go and strive for a job which will pay them a lot of money, and they will work for a boss. And this is quite a contrast to what I was learning from my relatives back home, where we were taught to respect the lands and to be connected with our community, not to compete against one each other for jobs, which I see more prominent here in Canada. Now, all this is to say that the Indigenous traditional method of teaching are often overlooked by those in power. It is a dilemma which is problematized given Canada's history of residential schooling. The upheaval and integration of Indigenous-based learning should be the number one priority to nurture and help develop community-based learning methods. To understand this Indigenous learning, I will talk about an article I read a while back by Vanessa Watts, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology in McMaster University. She has a lot of amazing articles, so I would suggest you guys would read some of her articles, which covers as many complex Indigenous issues. Well, this article is titled Indigenous Playstyle and Agency Amongst Human and Non-Human. First World and Sky Women Go on a European World Tour. Now, Watts draws upon this misinterpretation of Indigenous practices and customs by Western intellects as a persistent loop that leads to this invalidation within Eurocentric countries. That's pretty much saying that Western thinkers would often devalue this indigenous way of life, and they would uphold this Western knowledge as being supreme. This collective theme of colonial ignorance seeks to invalidate the indigenous way of life and reveals the systematic implications that Eurocentric discourses work to supersede indigenous ability to govern themselves and exist outside of this Western way of life. And thus, within Canada, this residential schooling forced children to learn these Western values and Western ideologies, which were based on these neoliberalistic formulated beliefs, which oftentimes were very contradictory to what Indigenous children learned and their practice. And what makes it even more sadder is that Indigenous children were unable to practice their Indigenous culture, and this were to assimilate them into this westernized schooling system and work to eradicate indigenous culture pretty much. And to draw back to our earlier topic, like I said, residential schooling is a colonial method that works to devalue the indigenous knowledges and customs as being unadvised. However, it works to push this westernized way of life onto indigenous communities. Watts discussed this indigenous cosmology and how it was devalued by Western thinkers who were very opposed to such way of life. Another point of that article is that she discussed this Sky Woman and how she was ingrained with an indigenous cosmology, and again, Western thinkers would come and devalue this framework and teach young children that this is not the way to think, and all those cosmologies and the Sky Woman was all very false, and they would try to push this westernized Christianity and all these westernized based practices onto these children who were very vulnerable in that because they were ripped apart from their family and forced to comply to these Western rules, which is very problematic in itself. So yeah, as people, we could a study done by Elek, Gubhaju, and Lloyd-Johnsen and Eades draws upon primitive actions on how Indigenous children and families engage in this customer culture and which works to preserve a strong sense of cultural identity and may even serve as a protective factor. Even in relation to course content, there was a book we read, The Seven Fallen Feathers, and we see how many children did not have these measures and forced into the residential schooling where they could not practice their culture, which had a very detrimental effect which resulted in them losing their lives. They highlight how early childhood program educations that focus on learning, development, and the overall well-being of Indigenous children have the power to enhance their development, their cognitive development, and their overall readiness for school, which might help offset this colonialism as a lasting effect or a lasting consequence. And even in the course textbook, Chapter 7, there's a discussion of how socio-economical factors influence the schooling system and education as a whole. It states that a student's socio-economic level has a great influence on how far they're able to go within the Western schooling system, I might clarify. And honestly, in relation to Indigenous children who are forced into residential schoolings and are held to these Western standards are often considered minorities and often result in their ability to strive for high levels of education being very minimal, and often they are unable to succeed to the same level as someone who's grown up in these Euro-Western societies. We need to question this shift as people who are living on Indigenous lands and who are fortunate enough to attend schools, and we need to be reflective of ourselves as people and how we can come together and make a change, but fight for some reforms in the education system which can work to minimize these issues that are present in it. I hope this podcast has reached out to you and opened your eyes on this ongoing issue. And even if you're not living in Canada, or you're a student who's in Canada right now, even if this issue is not really present in your country, you should still work to support our Indigenous peoples and this movement for change and reform. Thank you for attending the Reddy's podcast. I'm Abdisa, and I'll see you in the next one. There has been no use of AI generative technology